All right, so today we're going to do a deep dive into, well, this whole Russia-Ukraine thing everyone's talking about.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to ignore at this point.
Right, and there's been a lot happening lately with, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia getting involved.
Yeah, so lots of moving pieces, and it can be tough to follow.
Yeah, for sure. So we're going to break down some of the key developments for you and hopefully make some sense of it all.
Exactly.
Okay, so the first thing to understand is that Russia and the U.S. are actually scheduled to have talks.
Yeah, in-person talks.
Yeah, which is pretty significant considering, the current state of things.
Right. It's not every day you see these two countries sitting down together, especially with everything going on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So these talks are actually happening in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia.
On March 24th.
Yeah, and this is really interesting because it sort of puts Saudi Arabia in this unexpected position of, being a mediator or a facilitator for these discussions.
But definitely not a role they've traditionally played in these types of conflicts.
Right. And it comes right after some pretty important phone calls that happened just a few days ago.
Yeah. President Trump actually spoke with both President Putin and President Zelensky over the phone.
On March 18th and 19th.
Yeah, so this is all happening in pretty rapid succession, which suggests there's a real push to at least explore the possibility of de-escalating the situation.
So let's talk about these talks in Saudi Arabia a bit more because, Russia's already made some comments about what they're expecting.
Yeah, Dmitry Peskov, who's the press secretary for President Putin, basically came out and said that these negotiations are going to be not easy.
So not exactly setting a super optimistic tone right from the start.
Yeah, it's a pretty clear indication that they're anticipating some tough discussions and that, they're not going in with any illusions about it being a walk in the park.
And one of the main things they're going to be talking about is this whole Black Sea initiative.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
So for those who might not remember, this was that agreement that allowed for the export of grain from Ukrainian ports.
And it was also supposed to ease restrictions on Russian agricultural products.
So in theory, it was meant to be a win-win for both sides.
Right.
But then Russia actually pulled out of the deal back in the summer of 2023.
Yeah, they claimed that the part of the agreement that was supposed to benefit them wasn't being honored.
Yeah, essentially, they said they weren't seeing any easing of those restrictions on their own exports.
And Peskov really emphasized this point.
Yeah.
He said that Russia had fulfilled its obligations under the agreement, but that his own conditions had not been met.
And he even pointed out that the UN Secretary General was a guarantor for the initial agreement. So, there's this sense of them feeling like they were let down.
It's a pretty clear message that they're not going to just jump back into this without some serious assurances that things will be different this time around.
Right. But interestingly, Peskov also said something that sounded a little more hopeful.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
He mentioned that Russia is actually quite receptive to the tone that the new U.S. administration has been using when it comes to things like peace and mutually beneficial cooperation.
So there might be a little sliver of an opening there.
Yeah, it's almost like they're signaling a willingness to at least engage with the U.S. on these issues.
It's definitely something to watch.
So now let's switch gears a bit and look at what the U.S. is hoping to get out of these talks.
Right.
Well, from what we're hearing from sources who are familiar with the U.S.'s plans, it seems like they're aiming for a ceasefire by April 20th.
April 20th. Why that date?
Well, it happens to coincide with both Catholic and Orthodox Easter this year.
Oh, okay. So there's a symbolic aspect to it.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe they're hoping for a period of peace that aligns with these important religious holidays.
It's certainly a nice thought.
Right. But these same sources are also saying that this timeline could easily shift.
Yeah, I mean, with all the complexities involved and the disagreements between the parties, it's definitely not a sure thing.
And then you have President Trump, who has also weighed in on this whole thing.
Right. What's he been saying?
He's actually been pretty vocal about believing that they can reach a full ceasefire fairly quickly.
Even with all the attacks that are still going on?
Yeah, he seems to be pretty optimistic about it.
Well, he has said that efforts to prevent further escalation are, in some degree, under control.
And he's also emphasized his good relationships with both Putin and Zelensky. So, he clearly sees those personal connections as being really important in this whole process.
It's definitely part of his approach to diplomacy.
So let's get into the nitty-gritty of these talks in Saudi Arabia, because it sounds like they're going to cover a lot of ground.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot on the agenda.
So one of the main things I'll be focusing on is the technical stuff related to implementing and then monitoring a 30-day ceasefire.
Which makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you need to have all the details worked out if you're actually going to make it happen.
Exactly. Like, how do you define a ceasefire? What are the specific actions that are allowed and not allowed? And then how do you verify that everyone is sticking to it?
Right. You need a clear framework.
Yeah. And the ceasefire isn't just about, ground fighting either.
No. It sounds like they're also going to be talking about potentially expanding it to cover vessels in the Black Sea.
Which directly ties back to the whole issue of maritime security and, maybe even reviving that grain deal we talked about earlier.
It's all interconnected.
So we know who's representing the U.S. in these talks.
It's their special envoy for Ukraine, who's basically their point person for dealing with Kyiv.
Right. And they've already been pretty active trying to get these discussions going.
Yeah, they've been doing a lot of what's called shuttle diplomacy.
Which basically means going back and forth between the different parties trying to find common ground.
Exactly.
And they've also said that there will be some indirect talks happening in Saudi Arabia involving the U.S., Russia, and Ukraine.
So it sounds like they're trying to approach this from multiple angles.
Yeah. And Ukraine has confirmed that they're planning to have a bilateral meeting with the U.S. delegation
to discuss the parameters of proposals for a ceasefire.
So it's clear that they're actively involved in these diplomatic efforts as well.
Definitely.
But of course, with any negotiation like this, there are going to be some major hurdles.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, Russia has already put forward some pretty significant demands in exchange for agreeing to anything.
Like what?
Well, the biggest one is a complete halt to all arms supplies going to Ukraine.
That's a big ask.
Yeah, I mean, Ukraine and its allies are pretty unlikely to agree to that.
Right, because it would essentially leave them completely vulnerable.
And while there were some reports that the White House briefly paused some vital arms shipments earlier this month.
Yeah, I remember that.
It seems like that was more of a temporary thing to maybe, try and exert some pressure.
But it doesn't sound like the U.S. is willing to commit to a long-term stoppage of those arms deliveries.
Yeah, and some European officials are actually pretty worried about all of this. Well, they're concerned that President Trump's desire to get a diplomatic win might end up with him making concessions that aren't really in Ukraine's best interest.
So they're worried he might give away too much in an effort to get a deal.
Yeah, and there's also the question of whether Russia is actually serious about wanting a ceasefire right now.
I mean, some analysts are suggesting that Putin might be trying to delay things as much as possible.
Why would he do that?
Well, it could be that he's hoping to secure more concessions or maybe make some more gains on the battlefield before he's willing to really engage in serious negotiations.
That's a pretty cynical view.
It is, but, it's a possibility that can't be ruled out.
And the president of Lithuania actually said something along those lines recently.
Really? What did he say?
He basically accused Russia of just imitating negotiations and said that they're not even prepared to stick to a ceasefire when it comes to attacks on critical infrastructure.
That's a pretty strong statement.
Yeah. And, we have seen reports of increased Russian drone attacks on Ukrainian cities lately.
Which doesn't exactly paint a picture of de-escalation.
Right. Although it's worth noting that Russia claims it doesn't intentionally target civilian infrastructure.
Of course they would say that.
Right. But either way, it definitely raises questions about their commitment to a genuine ceasefire.
And, of course, we can't forget that Ukraine has also continued its own air attacks inside Russia.
And the Russian Ministry of Defense claims they've shot down hundreds of Ukrainian drones just in the past day.
So yeah, there's still a lot of fighting going on despite these diplomatic efforts.
And President Zelensky has been very vocal about demanding stronger action against Russia.
Yeah, he's calling for new decisions, increased international pressure, and tougher sanctions.
It's clear that he's not backing down.
No, he's determined to keep resisting.
All right, so let's talk about who's actually going to be at these talks in Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
So on the Ukrainian side, they're sending a pretty high-level delegation.
Including their defense minister.
Yeah, and two of President Zelensky's top aides.
So it's a pretty serious group.
And they're reportedly putting together a list of specific targets that they want to be included in any limited ceasefire agreement.
That makes sense. They want to make sure their priorities are addressed.
Right, and on the Russian side, it seems like they're sending a more junior delegation.
Oh, interesting. Why is that?
Well, it's not entirely clear, but it could be a deliberate tactic.
A tactic? How so?
Well, one Russian political analyst suggested that these particular representatives are well suited for what he called unhurried negotiations.
So basically slowing things down.
Yeah, maybe giving Russia more time to achieve certain objectives or, just refine their negotiating position.
It's a possibility.
And then there's the whole question of whether President Trump and President Putin might actually meet face to face.
Yeah, that's been a big topic of speculation.
But from what we're hearing, it doesn't seem likely to happen anytime soon.
Not until at least mid-April.
And even then, it's all contingent on whether there's some real progress made at these lower level talks.
Yeah, they want to see concrete results first.
The Kremlin's press secretary even said that a presidential summit would only really be productive after they've established some level of mutual understanding at the technical level.
So it's a wait-and-see approach.
Now, stepping back for a moment, there might be some other factors at play here that are influencing Russia's willingness to consider a ceasefire.
Like what?
Well, there's a theory that they might be hesitant to make any big moves because it could complicate their relationships with countries like China, Iran, and North Korea.
Oh, yeah. Those are some pretty important alliances for them.
Exactly. And we know that Putin's top security aide recently went to North Korea to brief Kim Jong-un on the situation.
And there have been reports that North Korea has been supplying Russia with weapons and maybe even troops.
Although it's important to note that those reports haven't been officially confirmed.
Right, but it definitely raises some eyebrows.
So it's possible that Russia doesn't want to do anything that could jeopardize those relationships.
It's a strategic consideration for sure.
Now, what about the U.S.? What are their non-negotiables in all of this?
Well, they've made it very clear that any deal has to be acceptable to Ukraine.
They're not going to force anything on them.
No, and they're also not going to agree to a summit with Putin unless there's a solid ceasefire agreement already in place.
So it's a two-pronged approach.
Exact.
And the U.S. Special Envoy has actually been sounding pretty optimistic lately.
Really? How so?
He's been saying that they've made significant progress in the conflict over the past couple of months, and he thinks they're close to achieving that initial goal of a 30-day ceasefire.
Which would then hopefully lead to more permanent solution.
Right. But, you know, it's probably best to take his optimism with a grain of salt, considering all the challenges we've already talked about.
Yeah, it's a complicated situation.
Now, one thing that's not really on the table right now is Ukraine joining NATO.
That's been a sticking point for a while.
Yeah, but they are talking about the possibility of some alternative security guarantees.
Like what?
Well, it could be something modeled after Article 5 of the NATO treaty.
Which is the part about collective defense.
Exactly. So it would be a way to give Ukraine some protection without actually making them a full member of NATO.
It's an interesting idea.
And President Trump has also been pushing for economic deals with Ukraine.
Why is that?
He basically wants to make sure the U.S. has a financial stake in Ukraine's post-war recovery.
So they're invested in their success.
Right.
Now, there's also been some talk about the U.S. potentially taking control of Ukraine's nuclear power plants.
Yeah, there were some reports about that.
But President Zelensky has denied that it's even being discussed.
And he's made it clear that he's not interested in handing over control of those facilities.
Which is understandable.
Yeah, it's a matter of national sovereignty.
For sure.
So what about Europe? What are they thinking about all of this?
Well, they're watching it all very closely.
But there seems to be some skepticism among European leaders.
Skepticism about what?
Well, they're not sure that President Trump will be willing or able to put enough pressure on Russia if they don't cooperate.
They're worried he might not be tough enough.
Yeah, and they're also facing their own challenges in terms of trying to put together a peacekeeping force.
It's not easy to get everyone on the same page.
And the UK Prime Minister has actually shifted his focus to providing air and sea support.
Because it's just too difficult to deploy enough ground troops.
Right, and they're all very aware that Russia is strongly opposed to any European troop deployment in Ukraine.
That's a red line for them.
So at the end of the day, it seems like Russia's trying to play this very strategically.
Yeah, trying to maximize their gains.
And they might be seeing this as a good opportunity to negotiate something.
Maybe a partial ceasefire or some smaller agreements that work in their favor.
It's a delicate balance.
Definitely.
So as you can see, these talks in Saudi Arabia are incredibly complex.
Oh yeah, there's so many different factors at play.
You've got Russia, the U.S., Ukraine, all with their own goals and priorities.
And there are still some major sticking points that need to be resolved.
Like the scope of the ceasefire, territorial considerations, security guarantees, all that stuff.
It's a long road ahead.
And whether these talks will actually lead to de-escalation or just more deadlock remains to be seen.
We'll just have to wait and see.
Okay, well, that's our deep dive for you today.
Hope it was helpful.
Yeah, if you want to stay up to date on all of this, be sure to subscribe to our podcast.
Yeah, we're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube.
We are here to make things clear, new episodes every day.